To say that this has been quite a year for AI is probably a massive understatement, but it has. And in a world where I feel like there's a lot of recency bias in terms of what we remember as the latest crazy story or the things that happened this year, I could not tell you what happened in January of 2023. I thought it might be fun to look back on this year and talk about my 5 unfiltered opinions on things that happened in AI in 2023. These are just my thoughts off the cuff, and I would also love to hear yours, so leave a comment down below with your unfiltered hot takes. Alright, so first of all, you'll notice that I'd never made a video on the OpenAI Sam Altman weekend firing, rehiring situation. That was somewhat intentional because I do think that the chaos of that weekend was surprising. The board firing him and then having 2 interim CEOs and then him coming back and having his job on the following Monday. That chaos was a lot and was not something that I at all expected. OpenAI had been, in my opinion at least, coming to a fork in the road for quite a while, and a lot of it just has to do with the structure of the company. So you may or may not be aware, but OpenAI has a for-profit arm and a non-profit arm. And the idea behind this corporate structure is that the non-profit arm has a mission and values around creating safe AGI systems that guides the for-profit arm, that acts as the counterbalance to the for-profit arm such that ideally it doesn't run rogue. However, that structure, especially if you're looking to raise money for products, raise money to invest in the research side, raise money to run things like ChatGPT, that structure almost inevitably seems like it would lead you, or at least to me, it inevitably seemed like it would lead you to a point at which you need to figure out whether you are prioritizing making money or doing more research. And I don't know, I don't think that there's a good or bad decision in terms of that dichotomy on a general level, because like that's a challenge for many businesses in the sense that you may not, I mean, that's a challenge for making YouTube content. You have to think about, there's the content that I really enjoy making, which might be like deep dives into papers or quirky recipe videos or whatever. And then there's the content that supports the channel and makes it possible for me to make those kinds of videos. I think that in my case, that dichotomy is a little more easily resolved, partially because I'm just a much smaller company. I mean, not quotes, I am a company. And so I don't have to worry as much about scaling. But when it comes to OpenAI, I think that you do eventually run into an issue of which of these things is going to take precedent, because if the research side takes precedent, the company ultimately cannot grow, it cannot scale that far because of the time and money and effort it takes to do AI safety research, but also because AI safety research isn't necessarily sexy, and so it becomes a lot harder to pitch it. So for quite a while, I've been expecting the company to kind of choose which direction it was going to go, and I fully thought that they were going to go the for-profit route. Like, the company structure would remain the same, but I fully thought that they were going to lean into products. And so in that sense, I think that the situation in terms of where the company is now and the direction that Sam has clearly pointed that it's going to go in, that part's not surprising at all. I think what was surprising was almost the last gasp for air in terms of the board firing him for reasons that seemed quite unclear at the time, bringing in 2 interim people, very quickly obviously backtracking on that decision, realizing that they up because of a lot of reasons, but one of them being most of the employees decided that they would also go to Microsoft with Sam and Greg Brockman if they were not reinstated in their positions. And obviously all of this ending with Sam back in the position that he was originally in. So at this point, I'll mostly be curious to see what happens with the research team. If you're focusing more on product, that kind of necessarily results in diverting resources in one direction. And so I think even leading up to this, they were running into issues where the research team didn't necessarily have the resources to be able to do the kind of work that they wanted. But I also think that there's been a slow exodus of, I think, people who are more interested in the research side and more interested in kind of the fairness safety side for several years now. That's resulted in companies like Anthropic and Hugging Face and Stability. And so I think I'm at this point more curious about how that landscape will shift as OpenAI kind of leans more into the product for profit arm, like companies like Microsoft, which also owns a equity stake in the company, and less so like companies like Google, because Google still has a very strong research arm. And I'm curious to see how that will go. Next, we have AI influencers slash AI girlfriends slash creators using AI to build parasocial relationships with their audiences. I won't say this is something I didn't see coming. I don't know that I expected individual creators to do things like making an AI girlfriend that would be something that people could purchase access to on like a one-on-one level, so it really did feel like you were interacting one-on-one with that person. I also didn't expect Meta doing the AI friends thing with like Mr. Beast and Lord DIY. No shade against any of the creators who participated in it. I just remember that coming out and thinking that was very strange, because the avatars also are supposed to be other people, like they're supposed to be like your best friend or like your buddy or whatever, but they're very clearly recognizable as people who have brands and platforms, and I think that makes the dynamics of that interaction like very odd. I'll be curious to see where that goes. I know that on the AI girlfriend front, a lot of the people who are doing that are being approached by the company that offers that service, so they're taking a share of that income. And not necessarily having to do the work around it. But I also, especially someone who has a brand and an audience, I'm personally quite deliberate, I guess I would say, about how I cultivate parasocial relationships, how I give my audience access to, how much of myself I give you access to. And so, at least for me personally, I think I'd be pretty uncomfortable with someone interacting with a virtual version of me in that capacity, because I think that it just makes the dynamics and the sense of knowing me uncomfortable and weird in a way that I think would also affect how people would engage with me, the actual person, and how their engagements with the system would frame that. So I'll be curious to see where that goes. I don't like it personally. It gives me the ick, but we'll see what happens. Ooh, this next one is inspired by my most popular video, which is the video on automated exam proctoring, which it's always funny to me that that's my most viewed video, because if you look at my analytics, it's my most viewed because people are looking up ways to like cheat on their exams, which is like not at all what the video is about. But you know, I still get the AdSense revenue, so we're all happy. But I think that this was the year of a lot of panic around ChatGPT, education, and plagiarism detection. And while I don't find that super surprising, I did a podcast earlier in the year on AI in education. One of the things that we talked about is how, like, when I was growing up, I feel like Wikipedia was the equivalent of ChatGPT now, where you were always told, like, don't use Wikipedia as a source and like all that kind of stuff, because you like can't trust what's on it because it's community generated and moderated. And so I feel like that's where we are with ChatGPT in the educational system, although it is obviously a bit easier to have it generate specific information that you would use for like a homework assignment versus having to like read the wiki page and like pull the information out personally. I think what became obvious very quickly, and what I kind of assumed would happen, was that these AI generated text detectors are not very good at identifying generated text. In particular, they tend to flag text written by non-native English speakers as AI generated. And so, like, what do we do about that? I don't know. And so I think that there's an interesting opportunity here to be proactive about how AI is incorporated into the educational system and how students use it. Because at the end of the day, chances are they're going to use it. Chances are these detectors are still going to have pretty high false positive rates. And I think that there are more interesting ways, I guess, that you could get ahead of that in terms of using ChatGPT to help people generate an essay and then having them critique the essay and point out where it makes, you know, different rhetorical fallacy arguments, and having students learn that way. So I'll be curious to see what happens with that in the future, but I don't know that, because I also, like, I was taking a class this year, an AI Ventures class, and we were allowed to use generative AI for our assignments. We just had to, in the case of ChatGPT, you had to link to the conversation that you had with ChatGPT when you submitted the assignment, and you did have to basically write things up kind of, not in your own words, but you couldn't just like copy paste. And I was okay with that, especially because you still had to do a lot of your own sourcing, and a lot of what I was using ChatGPT for in that moment was paraphrasing things, reorganizing ideas, figuring out how to like lay things out. I don't know. I personally think that's fine. So we'll see what happens. Next is a quick one. This is around existential risk, AI doomers, 6-month bans on AI research, sparks of AGI paper, which I did a live stream on, and also AI policy. I was not surprised at the discourse around this year. And I think one of the main reasons why I wasn't surprised is because I've been seeing this discourse on Twitter for like 3 years now. And Twitter just ends up bleeding into like Congress a lot of the time. And so my unfiltered thought on that whole swath of things is that I wish Twitter didn't influence politics quite so much, and that people did their own research or talked to actual experts instead of just leaning into the Twitter discourse, because I think that is a bit of a red herring at the end of the day a lot of the time, and that we could be focusing on like actual effective policy implementation instead of whatever everyone is freaking out on the internet about. That's just me. And then last but not least, the New York Times copyright situation. That was a last minute addition to this because that just came out. But more broadly, AI and the writers and actors strikes, the legal situation around Gen AI kind of more broadly. I think this was a really interesting year for this. I think that this is a reckoning that we're gonna have to continue to have, especially with this New York Times copyright case, and leave a comment below if you'd like me to get into that in another video. But I think that what was interesting about this year was that there was a lot more mainstream recognition that this is an issue as it relates to people who are using this kind of stuff for their work, and also a larger conversation around like the value of art and content and things that get turned into trading data for these systems and why they tend to be historically undervalued within Western society. Which is all to say that I do think that figuring this out, like fixing this, will require a pretty significant shift in how we think about ownership that I think has already been happening, but is just not codified into law. And so I'm curious, especially since I think these things have been happening on smaller levels. So I think about, you know, platforms like Archive of Our Own and the distinction between fan fiction and, you know, using the IP of existing series or industries and using it for your own work, where fan fiction is a distinct category, and so it does not infringe on those IP rights. But if you were to publish a book, then it absolutely would. And so I think that, I hope, I guess, that we see more discussions with groups like that, discussions with groups that have created more modern concepts around ownership and how to take existing art or existing content and use it in other works, ideally compensate people for the use of their work, and then also just like create clearer lines between what is plagiarism and what is not plagiarism. I also have a bunch of other thoughts on the recent findings about what's in the data set that underlies a lot of language models, and I'm not going to talk about it because I'm pretty sure this video would get demonetized and or age restricted if I did, but I'll leave an article, I guess, somewhere. I'm excited to see where this New York Times case goes. For those who don't know, the New York Times is suing OpenAI for the use of New York Times content that New York Times has the copyright ownership over, and given that this is such a big, given the size of the New York Times and the fact that I think it has more leverage in this kind of legal argument than people like Sarah Silverman or smaller groups that have attempted to sue OpenAI, I'm very curious as to how this plays out. I'm particularly curious as to whether or not the final ruling in this case is only on this issue, like the issue specifically between the New York Times and OpenAI, or whether it actually acts to set a precedence for the line of what you can and cannot do with other people's stuff. And so that will probably be something that comes up on the channel a bunch in the coming year. And if you have any questions about that or anything you want me to cover, let me know. So obviously, interesting year in AI. And I think a lot of my unfiltered thoughts on this are, I wouldn't say super negative, but not like positive. I don't think that they lean into the AI doom category, but are definitely in the how are human beings going to handle this thing that is quite complicated, especially given that we've lost all sense of nuance in the modern discourse category. And so I think in spite of all this, what I surprised myself with when I was making this video is that I'm looking forward to what AI will look like in 2024. In fact, I have some potentially spicy takes on what that will look like. That'll be in a video next week. So subscribe and click on the bell if you want to get notified about that. But as a quick spoiler, having talked to a bunch of researchers, scientists, designers, I think that 2024 will be a cool year for interdisciplinary AI systems, particularly in fields that we don't necessarily think about as much. In fact, one of the things that actually did surprise me in those conversations was how many of these researchers, designers, and scientists that I spoke with taught themselves a lot of the foundational knowledge that they needed in order to pursue the projects that they're pursuing. And I mean, it kind of makes sense. The knowledge that you need to learn in order to do interdisciplinary work is rarely covered by a single textbook. As someone who does interdisciplinary work, it's definitely not. So if you found yourself inspired by this kind, you should probably know that learning enough to get off the ground doesn't have to take thousands of dollars or years of schooling. It can actually be free and easy, and you can start today on Brilliant. Brilliant isn't just another platform, it's the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively. Whatever your skill level, Brilliant customizes content to fit your needs and lets you solve at your own pace. And I know there are so many awesome courses that you might not know where to start, but don't worry, you can take a quick quiz when you sign up, and you'll be matched with content that fits your skill level and interests, whether you are a complete beginner or you're ready to write programs for a quantum computer. In fact, Brilliant's course on neural networks would be a great place to start if you're interested in AI in 2024. It breaks down complex topics, making them interactive and easy to grasp. Personally, I've been loving their course on exploring data visually. I've always preferred visual learning to learning from a textbook, and this course has been a great way to refresh my data analysis knowledge in an accessible way. So if you're ready to embark on a learning journey that is both fun and educational, go to brilliant.org/Jordan for a free 30-day trial, and the first 200 of my subscribers to use that link will also get 20% off the annual premium subscription. So dive in, challenge yourself, and let's demystify AI together. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video and for continuously empowering all of us with knowledge.